The morning rush at Bella's Cafe was always chaotic, but Sarah Martinez had grown used to the constant stream of customers demanding their coffee fix before work. Steam rose from the espresso machine as she worked efficiently behind the counter, her movements practiced and quick. The small downtown cafe was her pride and joy, inherited from her grandmother 3 years ago when she passed away. Sarah had always been particular about her establishment. Clean tables, fresh pastries, and, most importantly, treating every customer with respect. That was until Marcus Coleman started coming in. The first time she saw him, Sarah immediately felt uncomfortable. Something about the way he carried himself, the cold look in his eyes, and the rough manner in which he spoke to her younger employees made her skin crawl. Marcus was a large man in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that looked like they had seen violence. He wore simple clothes, nothing fancy, but there was an intensity about him that made everyone nervous. Black coffee, no sugar. He would grunt at whoever was unlucky enough to serve him. He never said please or thank you, never made eye contact, and had a habit of staring at people in a way that made them shift uncomfortably. The younger girls who worked part-time during college were especially afraid of him. It started small. Marcus would come in during the morning rush, order his coffee, and sit in the corner booth for hours. He would watch people, sometimes taking notes in a small notebook. Customers began to complain quietly to Sarah about feeling watched, about the strange man in the corner who made them nervous. Then the incidents began. Marcus would make inappropriate comments to the female customers, especially the younger ones. He would follow them with his eyes as they moved around the cafe. And, more than once, Sarah had seen him try to engage teenage girls in conversation that clearly made them uncomfortable. The breaking point came on a busy Friday morning. Emma, Sarah's 18-year-old employee, was serving Marcus his usual black coffee when he grabbed her wrist as she set the cup down. Emma pulled away quickly, spilling coffee on the table. "Next time, be more careful, sweetheart," Marcus said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Emma's hands were shaking as she cleaned up the spill. Sarah watched from across the cafe, her anger building. She had heard similar stories from her other employees, but this was the first time she had witnessed his behavior firsthand. That evening, after closing the cafe, Sarah made a decision. She gathered her 3 employees together in the small break room behind the counter. Emma was still visibly shaken from the morning's incident, while Jake, the only male employee, looked angry on her behalf. Maria, the older woman who worked weekends, nodded knowingly as Sarah began to speak. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Sarah said, her voice firm. "That man, Marcus Coleman, is making everyone uncomfortable. He's inappropriate with our female customers and employees, and I've decided we're not going to serve him anymore." Emma looked relieved, but Jake seemed concerned. "Can you legally do that?" he asked. "What if he causes trouble?" Sarah had already researched this. "We have the right to refuse service to anyone who makes our employees or customers feel unsafe. I've documented the incidents and I have witnesses. We're a private business and we don't have to tolerate harassment." Maria spoke up, her voice carrying years of experience in customer service. "I've worked in restaurants for 30 years, and I can tell you that man is trouble. There's something dark about him. You're making the right choice, Sarah." The plan was simple. The next time Marcus came in, Sarah would personally handle the situation. She would tell him calmly but firmly that his behavior was unacceptable and that he was no longer welcome in the cafe. If he argued or caused a scene, she would call the police. That weekend, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important about Marcus Coleman. The way he carried himself, the way he observed everything around him with such intensity, the military-style haircut, and the disciplined way he sat perfectly straight in his chair. There were signs she couldn't quite piece together. On Sunday evening, she decided to do some research. Sarah wasn't usually one to investigate her customers, but something about Marcus bothered her beyond just his inappropriate behavior. She searched social media and local news articles, looking for any information about a Marcus Coleman in the area. What she found was mostly routine. A few mentions in local business directories, a brief reference to someone by that name in an old church newsletter. Nothing that explained the sense of unease she felt whenever he was in her cafe. Monday morning came quickly, and with it, the usual pre-work rush. Sarah positioned herself behind the counter, ready for whatever the day might bring. She had briefed her employees on the plan, and everyone knew that if Marcus came in, they should direct him to her immediately. At exactly 8:30, the door chimed, and Marcus Coleman walked in. He moved to his usual corner booth without ordering, clearly expecting someone to bring him his regular black coffee. Sarah took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked over to his table. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I need to speak with you." He looked up at her with those cold, calculating eyes, and for a moment, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. There was something predatory in his gaze, something that suggested he was used to intimidating people into submission. "I'm listening," he said simply. "Your behavior toward my employees and customers has been inappropriate," Sarah continued, maintaining eye contact despite her discomfort. "I've received multiple complaints, and I've witnessed the incidents myself. I'm going to have to ask you to leave and not come back." The cafe around them seemed to grow quiet. Other customers sensed the tension and turned to watch the confrontation. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "You have no idea who you're talking to," he said quietly. "No idea at all." Sarah felt her stomach drop at Marcus's words, but she forced herself to stand firm. The other customers in the cafe were now openly staring, sensing the tension in the air. Emma stood behind the counter, her face pale with worry, while Jake moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. "I don't care who you think you are," Sarah replied, her voice louder now. "This is my business, and you're making my employees and customers uncomfortable. You need to leave." Marcus slowly stood up from his chair, and Sarah was reminded of just how tall and imposing he was. At 6'3", he towered over her 5'4" frame, and she could see the muscle definition beneath his simple t-shirt. But what struck her most was the way he moved with a precision and control that spoke of years of military training. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice still quiet but carrying a threat that made Sarah's hands tremble. A very big mistake. The cafe had gone completely silent now. Even the espresso machine seemed to have stopped hissing. Sarah could feel the eyes of every customer on them, waiting to see what would happen next. She thought about backing down, about apologizing, and letting him stay, but then she remembered Emma's frightened face and the other incidents with young female customers. "The only mistake would be allowing you to continue harassing people in my establishment," Sarah shot back. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Marcus stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he began to laugh. It was a cold, humorless sound that sent chills down Sarah's spine. Several customers shifted uncomfortably, and she heard someone whisper about calling 911. "The police," Marcus said, still chuckling. "Oh, that's rich. You really have no clue, do you?" He reached into his back pocket, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he might be reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a worn leather wallet and threw it onto the table in front of her. "Take a look," he said. "Go ahead. Open it." Sarah hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the wallet and opened it, expecting to see a driver's license or credit cards. Instead, she found herself looking at a military identification card that made her blood run cold. The photo was definitely Marcus, but younger, wearing a formal military uniform with more decorations and medals than Sarah had ever seen on one person. But it was the text on the ID that made her legs feel weak. "Colonel Marcus Coleman, United States Army." And below that, in smaller text that she had to squint to read, "Former commanding officer, Fort Davidson Military Installation." Sarah's hands were shaking now as she looked up at Marcus. Fort Davidson was less than 50 miles from their small town, and Everyone in the area knew it was one of the largest military bases in the region. The idea that this man, this person she had just banned from her cafe, had once been in charge of thousands of soldiers was almost too much to process. "Now, do you understand?" Marcus asked, taking the wallet back from her trembling hands. "I've commanded more people than you'll ever meet in your entire life. I've made decisions that affected national security. And you think you can tell me where I can and can't drink coffee?" The other customers were starting to leave now, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Sarah heard the door chime repeatedly as people hurried out, probably afraid of what might happen next. Emma had tears in her eyes, and Jake looked like he was ready to fight despite being clearly outmatched. "I don't care what rank you used to hold," Sarah managed to say, though her voice was no longer as steady as before. "You're a civilian now, and you're my business. Military service doesn't give you the right to harass women." Marcus's expression darkened. "Used to hold," he repeated. "Lady, you really don't understand how this works. Once you've been where I've been, done what I've done, you never really stop being in command. People like you, people who've never served, never sacrificed anything for their country, you don't get to judge people like me." Sarah felt a flash of anger at his condescending tone. Her own father had served in Vietnam, and her grandfather had fought in World War II. She wasn't going to let this man lecture her about service and sacrifice. "My family has served too," she said firmly, "and they would be ashamed of how you're behaving. Military service is about protecting people, not intimidating them." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. His eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah's face, as if seeing her for the first time. "What did you say your name was?" he asked. "I didn't," Sarah replied. "But it's Sarah Martinez. And this is still my cafe, and you still need to leave." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Martinez. Your father wouldn't happen to be David Martinez, would he? Served in the 173rd Airborne in Vietnam." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her father had indeed served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, though he rarely talked about his time in Vietnam. "How could this man possibly know that?" "How do you know about my father?" she whispered. Marcus smiled again, but this time it was different. There was recognition in his eyes, and something that might have been respect. "David Martinez saved my life in 1968, Marcus said quietly. "I was a young lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, and I made a stupid mistake that almost got my entire platoon killed. Your father, who was just a sergeant at the time, disobeyed a direct order to pull back, and came after me when I was pinned down by enemy fire." Sarah stared at him in shock. Her father had mentioned saving a young officer once, but he had never given details. He always said that's what soldiers do for each other. "He carried me 2 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his shoulder," Marcus continued. "Never complained, never asked for recognition. Just did what needed to be done. I owe him my life." The cafe was completely empty now, except for Sarah, Marcus, and her employees. The silence stretched between them as Sarah tried to process this information. Her father, who had died 5 years ago from cancer, had never mentioned knowing anyone named Marcus Coleman. "If that's true," Sarah said slowly, "then you should understand even better why your behavior here is unacceptable. My father fought to protect people, especially those who couldn't protect themselves. What you've been doing to my employees and customers is the exact opposite of what he stood for." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see something shifting in his expression. The arrogance and intimidation were still there, but there was also something else, something that might have been shame. "Your father never told you about me, did he?" Marcus asked. "No," Sarah admitted. "He didn't talk much about the war." Marcus nodded slowly. "Smart man. Some things are better left buried." He looked around the empty cafe, then back at Sarah. "But some things have a way of coming back to haunt you, whether you want them to or not." That evening, after closing the cafe early due to the confrontation, Sarah drove to her mother's house on the outskirts of town. Elena Martinez was 73 years old, with silver hair and wise eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow. She had been married to David Martinez for 42 years before his death, and she still kept his military medals and photographs in a place of honor in their living room. "Mama," Sarah said as she sat down at the familiar kitchen table, "I need to ask you about Daddy's time in Vietnam." Elena looked up from the soup she was stirring, concern crossing her face. "Why do you want to know about that, Mija? Your father never liked talking about the war." Sarah told her mother about the incident at the cafe, about Marcus Coleman and his claim that her father had saved his life. As she spoke, she watched her mother's expression change from concern to recognition, and, finally, to something that looked like fear. "Marcus Coleman," Elena repeated quietly. "Yes, I remember that name." "You do?" Sarah was surprised. "Daddy told you about him." Elena sat down across from her daughter, her hands folded in her lap. "Your father had nightmares for years after he came back from Vietnam. He would wake up screaming, sweating, calling out names. Marcus was one of those names." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "What did Daddy tell you about him?" Elena was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Your father saved that man's life. That much is true. But he always regretted it. He said Marcus Coleman was the kind of officer who got good soldiers killed for no reason. Reckless, arrogant, caring more about his own career than the men under his command." "What happened?" Sarah asked. "Marcus had ordered his platoon to advance into what your father knew was a trap. The Vietnamese had been watching them for hours, waiting for them to walk into an ambush. Your father tried to warn him, but Marcus wouldn't listen. Said a sergeant had no business questioning an officer's orders." Elena paused, her eyes distant as she remembered her husband's words. When the shooting started, Marcus's entire platoon was pinned down. Most of them were just boys, barely out of high school. Your father watched 3 of them die, while Marcus cowered behind a fallen tree, too scared to move. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. "But Daddy saved him anyway." "Your father couldn't live with himself if he left anyone behind, even someone he despised. He crawled through enemy fire to reach Marcus, then carried him to safety. Got shot in the shoulder for his trouble, but he got that man out alive." "Did they see each other again after that?" Elena nodded grimly. "Marcus was transferred to a different unit after that incident. But about 6 months later, your father heard stories. Marcus had been promoted to captain and was commanding a company. The stories said he was using the same reckless tactics, sending men into situations where they didn't belong, taking unnecessary risks for personal glory." "What kind of stories?" "There was an incident at a village," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus's company was supposed to be on a routine patrol, but he decided to search the village for weapons. The villagers were just farmers, families with children. But Marcus convinced himself they were hiding enemy soldiers." Sarah leaned forward, dreading what she was about to hear. "He ordered his men to detain all the male villagers for questioning. When some of the villagers tried to protect their children, Marcus claimed they were resisting. Things escalated quickly. By the time it was over, 7 civilians were dead, including 2 children." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. "And Daddy knew about this?" "The story got around, but it was covered up. Marcus claimed the villagers had opened fire first, that his men were defending themselves. Most of the soldiers in his unit backed up his story, either because they believed it or because they were too scared to contradict their commanding officer. But not all of them." Elena shook her head. "One young soldier, a boy from Texas, tried to report what really happened. He said Marcus had given the order to shoot when the villagers were unarmed, that the children had died because Marcus panicked and made a terrible decision." "What happened to the soldier who tried to report it?" "He died 2 weeks later. Stepped on a landmine during what was supposed to be a safe patrol. Your father always suspected it wasn't an accident, that Marcus had sent him on a suicide mission to keep him quiet." Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to process what her mother had told her. The man who had been harassing her employees and customers wasn't just a rude ex-military officer. He was someone with a history of abuse of power, someone who had potentially covered up war crimes. "Mama, why didn't Daddy ever report what he knew?" Elena sighed deeply. "Your father tried, Mija. He went to his commanding officer, told him what he had heard about the village incident. But Marcus had powerful friends, people who vouched for his character. Your father was just a sergeant, and Marcus was becoming a rising star in the army. Who do you think they believed?" So Marcus got away with it? Not entirely. Your father kept asking questions, kept pushing for an investigation. Eventually, Marcus was quietly transferred to a different unit, then later to a desk job stateside. His career slowed down, but he never faced any real consequences. Sarah thought about the military ID Marcus had shown her, about his claim to have commanded Fort Davidson. He told me today that he used to be the commanding officer of Fort Davidson. Elena frowned. That's impossible. I would have known if he was stationed that close to us. Your father kept track of him over the years, always worried that their paths might cross again. Could he have been transferred there after Daddy died? Maybe, Elena said. But your father always said Marcus was the type to exaggerate his accomplishments. If he was in charge of Fort Davidson, it probably wasn't for very long. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Marcus Coleman, about the way he had intimidated her and her employees, about his sense of entitlement and his veiled threats. But now she also thought about the dead Vietnamese villagers, about the young soldier who had tried to speak the truth, about her father's nightmares, and his regret at saving a man who would go on to hurt others. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the cafe early and immediately called her friend Janet, who worked as a civilian administrator at Fort Davidson. If Marcus had really been a commanding officer there, Janet would know. Marcus Coleman? Janet repeated when Sarah asked. Oh, honey, you don't want anything to do with that man. Why? What do you know about him? He was here for about 18 months, from 2018 to early 2020. He wasn't the commanding officer, though. He was just the deputy commander. And he was forced into early retirement after some kind of scandal. Sarah's pulse quickened. What kind of scandal? I don't know all the details, but it involved inappropriate conduct with female soldiers under his command. There were several complaints, and the investigation found a pattern of behavior going back years. Sexual harassment, abuse of power, creating hostile work environments. The Army quietly forced him to retire to avoid a public court-martial. Is he still in the area? As far as I know, yes. He lives in one of those new developments about 20 minutes from town. Keeps a pretty low profile, but there have been rumors about him bothering women at the grocery store, the library, places like that. Most people just avoid him. After hanging up with Janet, Sarah sat in her empty cafe and thought about everything she had learned. Marcus Coleman wasn't just an unpleasant customer. He was a predator with a history of abusing his power and intimidating women. And now she had confronted him directly, had told him he wasn't welcome in her business. She thought about his parting words the day before. Some things have a way of coming back to haunt you, whether you want them to or not. At the time, she had thought he was talking about his war experiences. Now she wondered if it had been a threat. Sarah's fears proved to be well-founded. Over the next week, Marcus Coleman began what could only be described as a campaign of intimidation. It started subtly at first. He would park his black pickup truck across the street from the cafe and sit there for hours just watching. Customers began to notice and comment, asking Sarah if everything was okay. Then the phone calls began, always after closing time, always when Sarah was alone in the cafe doing paperwork or cleaning up. The caller never spoke, just breathed heavily into the phone for a few seconds before hanging up. Sarah knew it was Marcus without needing proof. On Thursday evening, Sarah arrived at the cafe to find a front window covered in what looked like coffee grounds, thrown against the glass in the middle of the night. The message was clear and petty, but it still made her hands shake as she cleaned it off before opening for the morning rush. Emma quit on Friday. The young college student came in for her shift pale and frightened, explaining that she had seen Marcus Coleman following her car as she drove home from her evening classes. She was too scared to continue working, afraid that he might escalate his behavior. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," Emma said, tears in her eyes. "I know you need the help, but I can't handle this. My parents want me to come stay with them until this blows over." Sarah couldn't blame her. In fact, she was relieved that Emma was prioritizing her safety. But losing her most reliable employee during the busy season was another blow to an already stressful situation. That evening, Sarah called the police. Detective Ray Morrison had been with the local department for 15 years, and Sarah had known him since high school. He listened patiently to her story, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. The problem is, most of what you're describing isn't technically illegal, Ray explained. Parking on a public street, making hang-up phone calls, even throwing coffee grounds on your window, it's all harassment, but it's misdemeanor stuff at best. And without proof that it's him, there's not much we can do. What about a restraining order? Sarah asked. You can try, but judges don't usually grant them unless there's a clear threat of physical violence. Has he actually threatened to hurt you? Sarah thought about Marcus's words in the cafe, about his veiled threats and intimidating presence. Not directly, but the implication was there. I believe you, Ray said, and I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. I'll increase patrols around your business, and I want you to call me immediately if anything escalates. But, Sarah, you need to be careful. Men like Coleman, especially with his military background, they can be unpredictable. After Ray left, Sarah sat alone in her cafe and seriously considered giving up. She could sell the business, use the money to start over somewhere else, somewhere Marcus Coleman couldn't find her. But the thought of letting him win, of abandoning the legacy her grandmother had left her, made her angry. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Sarah was opening the cafe when a woman in her 40s approached the counter. She had short brown hair, intelligent eyes, and carried herself with a confidence that reminded Sarah of her mother. Are you Sarah Martinez? The woman asked. Yes, can I help you? My name is Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes. I'm the current deputy commander at Fort Davidson. I heard about your situation with Marcus Coleman. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. How did you hear about it? Word travels fast in military circles, especially when it involves someone like Coleman. I also heard that your father served in Vietnam, that he and Marcus have history. Patricia ordered a coffee and sat down at one of the small tables near the counter. I want you to know that not everyone in the military is like Marcus Coleman. In fact, most of us find his behavior disgraceful. What can you tell me about him? Sarah asked, sitting down across from her. Patricia's expression grew serious. Officially, I can't discuss personnel matters. But unofficially, I can tell you that Marcus Coleman represents everything wrong with the old boys club mentality that the military has been working to change. He spent 40 years abusing his power and intimidating people who couldn't fight back. Is it true that he was forced into retirement? The Army conducted a thorough investigation into multiple complaints against him. Sexual harassment, creating hostile work environments, abuse of authority, inappropriate relationships with subordinates. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia leaned forward, her voice lowering. But here's what you need to understand about men like Coleman. They don't see retirement as punishment. They see it as the military failing to appreciate their contributions. In their minds, they're the victims, and anyone who opposed them is the enemy. So he blames the women who reported him. He blames everyone. The women who reported him, the officers who investigated him, the Army leadership who forced him out. Men like Coleman never accept responsibility for their actions. It's always someone else's fault. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What does that mean for me? Patricia's expression was grave. It means you've become a symbol to him. You're a woman who stood up to him, who told him he wasn't welcome. In his twisted worldview, that makes you part of the conspiracy against him. What should I do? Document everything. Keep records of every incident, every phone call, every time he shows up near your business. The police may not be able to act now, but if this escalates, you'll need evidence. Patricia reached into her jacket and pulled out a business card. This is the number for the base security office. If Coleman threatens you directly, or if you feel like you're in immediate danger, call them. They can't arrest him, but they can make it clear that the military community doesn't support his behavior. She also gave Sarah the contact information for a women's advocacy group that worked with military families. They have experience dealing with situations like this. They can provide resources, legal advice, and emotional support. As Patricia was leaving, she turned back to Sarah. Your father sounds like he was a good man. He tried to do the right thing in Vietnam, even when it was difficult. Don't let Marcus Coleman tarnish that legacy. That afternoon, Sarah called the advocacy group Patricia had recommended. The woman who answered, Maria Santos, was warm and knowledgeable, immediately understanding the situation Sarah was facing. Unfortunately, what you're experiencing is more common than you might think, Maria explained. Military men who abuse their power often continue that pattern after they leave the service. The difference is, as civilians, they have fewer consequences and less oversight. Maria connected Sarah with a lawyer who specialized in restraining orders and harassment cases. She also provided information about security measures Sarah could take, including installing cameras around her business and varying her daily routines. The most important thing to remember, Maria said, is that you're not alone in this. Coleman is counting on you feeling isolated and vulnerable. We're going to make sure that doesn't happen. Word of Sarah's situation began to spread through the community. Regular customers started staying longer, creating a natural presence that made it harder for Marcus to intimidate her. Jake, her remaining employee, convinced his older brother Mike, a former Marine, to start hanging around the cafe during busy periods. Local business owners also stepped up. Tom Richardson, who owned the hardware store next door, installed better lighting in the parking lot and made sure Sarah wasn't alone when she opened or closed. The owner of the bookstore across the street started keeping an eye on the cafe and promised to call the police if she saw Marcus lurking around. But despite the community support, Sarah could feel the stress wearing on her. She wasn't sleeping well, jumping at every sound, constantly looking over her shoulder. The joy she had once found in running her grandmother's cafe was being replaced by anxiety and fear. On Sunday evening, as Sarah was closing up alone, she heard footsteps outside the front door. Through the glass, she could see a tall figure standing just outside the pool of light from the street lamp. Her heart pounded as she realized Marcus Coleman had finally decided to make a more direct move. The door handle rattled as he tried to open it, but Sarah had already locked up for the night. Marcus pressed his face against the glass, his eyes meeting hers through the window. "We need to talk," he called out, his voice muffled but clearly threatening. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for her phone to call Ray Morrison. But before she could dial, Marcus stepped back from the window and disappeared into the darkness. She stood frozen for several minutes, afraid to move, afraid he might be waiting for her to come outside. When she finally felt safe enough to leave, Sarah called Ray from her car. He met her at the cafe within minutes, but by then, Marcus was long gone. There was no evidence he had been there except Sarah's testimony. "This is escalating," Ray said grimly. "I think it's time we had a more serious conversation about your safety." The breaking point came 3 days later in a way that nobody expected. Sarah was working the morning shift with Jake and Maria when Detective Morrison burst through the cafe door, his face grim but determined. "Sarah, I need you to come down to the station with me," he said. "We've arrested Marcus Coleman." Sarah's legs felt weak with relief, but she was also confused. What happened? Did he finally threaten someone directly? Ray's expression was serious. "It's bigger than that. We received a call this morning from a woman named Jennifer Walsh. She was one of the soldiers who filed complaints against Coleman at Fort Davidson. She's been tracking his behavior since his retirement, gathering evidence and testimonies from other victims." As Ray explained, Jennifer had been building a case against Marcus for months. She had connected with multiple women who had been harassed by him since his retirement, documenting a pattern of stalking and intimidation that stretched across 3 counties. "The coffee grounds on your window?" Ray continued. "We found the same substance on 2 other women's cars. The hang-up phone calls?" Jennifer had phone records showing calls from Coleman's number to at least 6 different women. And yesterday, he made a mistake. Marcus had followed a young mother home from the grocery store, parking outside her house and watching her children play in the yard. The woman had called the police immediately, and when officers arrived, they found Marcus sitting in his truck with a notebook full of details about various women in the area, including Sarah. The notebook contained your work schedule, your mother's address, even notes about your employees, Ray explained. It was clear evidence of stalking and criminal harassment. Jennifer Walsh had been working with law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions, and Marcus's arrest was the culmination of a coordinated effort to stop his predatory behavior. Later that day, Sarah met with Jennifer at the police station. Jennifer was a strong, confident woman in her 30s who had served as a sergeant under Marcus's command. She had been one of the first to file formal complaints about his behavior, despite knowing it could damage her military career. "I couldn't let him keep hurting people," Jennifer explained. "After the Army forced him into retirement, I thought that was the end of it. But then I started hearing stories from women in civilian communities, women who didn't have the resources or support systems that military victims have." Jennifer had used her military contacts and investigative skills to track Marcus's movements and document his harassment of multiple women. She had worked with victim advocacy groups and law enforcement to build a comprehensive case. "Men like Coleman think that leaving the military means they can escape consequences for their actions," Jennifer said. "I wanted to prove them wrong." The evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. In addition to the stalking charges related to Sarah and other women, investigators discovered that he had been violating the terms of his military retirement by misrepresenting his service record to potential employers and romantic partners. During the investigation, more details about Marcus's military career came to light. Sarah learned that her father's suspicions about the young soldier's death in Vietnam had been correct. Military records showed that Marcus had indeed sent Private James Morrison on the fatal patrol as retaliation for his attempts to report the village incident. The records also revealed that Marcus's claim to have commanded Fort Davidson was greatly exaggerated. He had served as deputy commander for only 14 months before being removed due to the harassment investigation. His actual military career, while long, was marked by multiple complaints, transfers, and disciplinary actions that had been covered up or ignored by superiors who wanted to avoid scandal. Marcus was ultimately sentenced to 2 years in prison for stalking, harassment, and fraud. The judge, a female veteran herself, was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks. "You spent 40 years abusing the authority and respect that comes with military service," Judge Patricia Chin said during sentencing. "You used your position to intimidate and harass women who trusted you to protect them. Your behavior is a disgrace to the uniform you once wore and the values you swore to uphold." The community response to Marcus's arrest was overwhelmingly supportive. Regular customers returned to the cafe, many expressing their admiration for Sarah's courage in standing up to him. Local news outlets covered the story, focusing on the importance of supporting victims of harassment and the collaborative effort that brought Marcus to justice. Emma returned to work, feeling safe now that Marcus was in custody. Several other young women applied for positions at the cafe, drawn by the story of Sarah's strength and the supportive community that had rallied around her. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes visited the cafe several times, becoming a regular customer and unofficial liaison between the military base and the civilian community. She worked to establish programs that would help identify and address inappropriate behavior before it escalated to the level of Marcus Coleman's actions. Jennifer Walsh moved to the area and started a nonprofit organization focused on helping victims of military-related harassment and abuse. She partnered with Maria Santos and other advocates to create a network of support for women facing similar situations. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Elena Martinez, her mother, brought with her a box of her father's old military documents that she had never shown to Sarah before. "I thought you might want to see these," Elena said, setting the box on the cafe's counter after hours. Among the papers, Sarah found a letter that her father had written but never sent. It was addressed to the commanding officer of Marcus Coleman's unit in Vietnam, detailing the village incident and requesting a formal investigation. "Why didn't he send it?" Sarah asked. "He tried," Elena explained. "But by the time he finished writing it, Marcus had already been transferred. Your father was told that pursuing the matter further would be pointless, that it would only damage his own career." At the bottom of the box, Sarah found a small photograph. It showed her father as a young soldier, smiling beside a group of other servicemen. On the back, in her father's handwriting, were the words, "The good ones." Vietnam 1968. He kept this to remind himself that most soldiers are good people, Elena explained. He didn't want the Marcus Colemans of the world to make him bitter about his service or cynical about the military. Sarah looked at the photo for a long time, thinking about her father's choice to save Marcus's life despite knowing what kind of man he was. She thought about Jennifer Walsh's determination to stop Marcus from hurting others, about Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's efforts to reform military culture, about her own decision to stand up to him despite the risks. A year later, Bella's Cafe was thriving more than ever. Sarah had used the experience to connect with other local business owners, creating a network of mutual support that helped everyone feel safer and more secure. The cafe had become an unofficial meeting place for women's advocacy groups and military families seeking community support. Jennifer Walsh's nonprofit had grown into a regional organization, helping hundreds of women navigate the complex process of reporting harassment and abuse. Several other military officers like Marcus have been investigated and prosecuted based on evidence gathered through Jennifer's network. Sarah often thought about the irony of the situation. Marcus Coleman had tried to intimidate her by revealing his military background, expecting her to be impressed or frightened by his former authority. Instead, his arrogance had led to his downfall and created a movement that would prevent him from hurting others. On quiet mornings, when Sarah was alone in the cafe preparing for the day ahead, she would sometimes look at her father's photograph and think about the choices people make when confronted with power and intimidation. Her father had chosen to save a life, even when he knew that life belonged to a bad man. Sarah had chosen to stand up to that same man when he tried to abuse his power as a civilian. The cafe's walls now displayed photos of local veterans and active-duty military personnel who embodied the values of service and protection. Jennifer Walsh's business card was prominently displayed next to the register, along with information about victim advocacy resources and support groups. Marcus Coleman's attempt to use his military service as a shield for his predatory behavior had ultimately exposed him and led to justice for his victims. The community that had rallied to support Sarah continued to thrive, connected by the understanding that standing up to bullies and predators requires courage. But that courage is multiplied when people support each other. Sarah never learned exactly what her father would have thought about her confrontation with Marcus Coleman, but she believed he would have been proud of her decision to protect her employees and customers, regardless of the personal cost. She had honored his memory not by being intimidated by Marcus's past authority, but by refusing to let that authority be used to hurt innocent people. The last entry in Marcus Coleman's notebook, found by police during his arrest, was a bitter rant about women who didn't know their place and military service being unappreciated by civilians. It was the final proof that he had learned nothing from his experiences, felt no remorse for his actions, and would have continued his predatory behavior if not stopped by the coordinated efforts of his victims and their supporters. Justice, Sarah realized, wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a community where people felt safe to speak up, where victims were believed and supported, and where predators couldn't hide behind past achievements or positions of authority. Marcus Coleman's military service, which should have been about protecting others, had become a tool for intimidation and abuse. But in the end, it was the true spirit of service embodied by people like Jennifer Walsh and Lieutenant Colonel Hayes that prevailed. The cafe continued to serve the community, no longer shadowed by fear or intimidation. And every morning as Sarah unlocked the doors and turned on the lights, she remembered that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but in small cafes where ordinary people choose to stand up for what's right.